Have you ever felt stuck or sad or sort of caught in the middle between where you are and where you wish you were, where you hoped to be? Have you ever been in that place? Maybe that is where you find yourself right now, like with all of us, either stuck at home or unable to be with other people that we care for, and really struggling with how do we navigate these strange and difficult waters of this in-between time of remembering what it was like to be together with the people we really cared for, and wondering, when can we be together with the people we care for again? How will we navigate these times we're in? If that's the way you feel, which is, I think, honestly, the way most of us feel right now, we are in a very similar place to the folks in the second chapter of Acts. Today is Pentecost, and as you can see, I'm wearing the red stole, which signifies in our traditional church year and the traditional colors that we use, the red of Pentecost. It is the one day of the year when red is the color that signifies the power and the importance of this day in the life of the church. We often refer to this as the birthday of the church. And what happens in the second chapter of Acts is, in a way, a replay or an echo of Genesis chapter 1 and Ezekiel chapter 37. Genesis chapter 1, the creation, where the Spirit of God blows across the face of the waters and sets the stage for a new creation. And in Ezekiel chapter 37, when there are dried bones bleached by the sun, representing the devastation of the people of Israel, and this now recreation of that group from dried bones that had no hope. In both cases, it's the Spirit of God that blows across, in the case of Genesis, the face of the waters. And in the case of Ezekiel, it is the Spirit of God, the wind of God, the breath of God, the ruach is the Hebrew word, that blows across those dried bones bleached by the sun that have no hope in them. And in both cases, there is, in Genesis, the new creation, and in Ezekiel, the recreation or the resurrection of people who had absolutely no way that they were going to survive without some kind of divine intervention. In the second chapter of Acts, this is what Luke, the author that we ascribe to the book of Acts, that this is the scene that, in a way, is portrayed by this writer of Acts. Luke brings out that creation story from Genesis and the recreation story, the resurrection story from Ezekiel 37, and gives us in this second chapter a reminder of God's powerful, inspiring Spirit that blows across the face of these believers, who in this instance were, I think, very much like us. They were kind of stuck. They were betwixt and between, as Kristen Koger said so well last week in her sermon, quoting from the theologian Karl Barth. There was this significant pause between Jesus being with them and inspiring them and pushing them forward, and suddenly Jesus ascending into heaven and leaving them on their own, empowering them, challenging them, calling them forth, and yet they were left on their own. There was this significant pause, and you can sense in that pause a sense of stuckness, where these folks were just really struggling with, what do we do now? It's in that pause, in that moment, where there is this rumbling and moving and a rushing like a mighty wind, and the fire of God's Spirit that now comes in and around those early believers. And there is now what we can call, use the word, we're going to use 4 different words to move us through this passage. And this first word, we simply say inspiration, the inspiration of God's Spirit coming on that early fellowship, both the individual believers and the corporate body of believers. They are experiencing the inspiration of God's Spirit. That is inspiration, the indwelling, the inmoving, the emerging of God's Spirit in and through that fellowship and those individuals. I loved Catherine's opening story and her welcome, and we're so thankful to have Catherine as the director of our music and arts here at First Baptist. And I hope you were inspired by what she said, as I was, in just remembering her early days as a 10-year-old girl, writing inspired words that she shared with her pastor about what God was doing in her life and why it was that she wanted to be a Christian. And the pastor being so moved, calling to her and asking to have a conversation. And it was in that conversation where Catherine described the movement of God's Spirit in her heart, the inspiration in that moment of feeling held and loved and inspired to move through the rest of her life, knowing that not only was she loved, but she was needed. She was called to do something beyond herself. The inspiration of God's Spirit. Many of us can share stories like this, these times in our lives, often in the midst of difficulty or loneliness or a sense of just simply not knowing what lies ahead. I had my own experience similar to that when I was in seminary. It was my first year of seminary, first semester of seminary. And of course, like many of us, I went into that situation thinking I was going to do great and found myself really very intimidated, very concerned, wondering, have I made the wrong choice? Did I misunderstand God's call in my life? I thought God wanted me to be a pastor, but I felt so insufficient. And in classes, I would hear these people talk about theologians that I'd never heard of before and talk about parts of the Bible I'd never studied before. They could articulate their faith and connect it with issues that were being experienced during those days in ways that I couldn't. I didn't have the vocabulary. I wasn't well-versed enough in the church history and biblical background. And I felt so intimidated and lost and lonely. And I found myself just really feeling sad and wondering if I'd made a mistake. And I remember one morning early in a devotional time that I had each morning and still like to try to practice today as a part of spiritual discipline, reading that morning from the 40th chapter of Isaiah. And I remember just moving through that 40th chapter and coming on these words. Have you not known? Have you not heard? The Lord is the everlasting God, the creator of the ends of the earth. He does not faint or grow weary. His understanding is unsearchable. He gives power to the faint and strengthens the powerless. Even youths will faint and be weary, and young will fall exhausted. But those who wait on the Lord shall renew their strength. They shall mount up with wings like eagles. They shall run and not be weary. They shall walk and not faint. I felt in those moments that these words were written especially for me. And there was something that happened in that moment in my little dorm room where I felt this surge of presence, a deep, abiding comfort, a thing that was kind of beyond language and my inability even now to fully explain, but just this strange, sort of in John Wesley's words, this strange warming of the heart and a feeling that it's going to be okay. Stay with what you're doing. Hang in there. Keep learning and growing. Don't give up. It was a moment of profound inspiration, and I continue to look back, like Catherine described in her early story, of reminding myself of that experience and how comforting and inspiring it continues to be. And many others like that throughout my life, and I'm sure your life. And all of us can talk about these stories. David Brooks, in his beautiful book, which I recommend, The Second Mountain, describes this experience of these times of being in the valley and often feeling completely abandoned and alone, and yet in that time having a profound sense of new
passion and calling that calls up the second mountain. It is a moment of inspiration. And as we move in and through this second chapter of Acts, that inspiration then lends itself to our second word, and that is liberation. There is something liberating about that moment where you realize you don't have to fit into what everybody else expects of you, that God has inspired you as you are, who you are enough. There is something profoundly liberating about that moment. Inspiration then lends itself to liberation. I love the American Sign Language sign for salvation. It is this sign where your hands are clasped across your chest as though they're bound. You're in bondage, and the word for salvation is the release from bondage. It's simply this sign. And salvation then is really the sign of liberation. You're set free from what had previously bound you. In the second chapter of Acts, we can sense these early believers. They have been in sort of a malaise. They weren't sure what to do. They aren't sure who they are exactly. And yet in this moment of the breaking down of barriers, of their linguistic differences, their cultural differences, suddenly in this second chapter, the wind of God, the breath of God, the Spirit of God, and the fire of God's Spirit transforms them. Inspiration then lends itself to liberation. They're set free from what had been and the concerns that they had, and now suddenly they are free to be who they are. Who they are and what God has made them is enough. And they are called now to move forward, liberated in God's inspiring Spirit, set on fire with the passion of God's hopes and dreams for their lives. It's a powerful setting now that sets the stage for our third word. So our first word is inspiration. Our second word is liberation. And now our third word is education. Just because you are inspired, just because you feel God has liberated you from the bonds that have held you back, doesn't mean that you and I still don't need to learn something new. We are called now in our inspiration and liberation to a new education. The word education is fascinating, by the way. Educare is the Latin word, and it means to literally pull out. The Socratic method, some of you are aware of, is this idea that the idea of education, and Socrates believed that it was asking questions of people and trying to help people understand what they already knew inside them, pulling out that knowledge and that sense of purpose and what really is lodged in the inner mind of all of us, some kind of consciousness of what is right and what is good and what is purposeful, what is meaningful. There's something in us that knows more than we recognize about us. We would say in our Christian terminology that it is God's Spirit inspiring our very souls to be more than we think we can be. This educare, this education, in a way is simply pulling out what already God has implanted in our spirits. And so this idea of education is partly that. It also, educare, means to lead forth. So it's a pulling out of what's probably already in you, but it's also a leading forth of where we need to go. And part of what Peter does now in this moment is to begin educating the crowd. They have been inspired. They are in the process of being liberated. They're enthusiastic. They have been set free from their cultural and linguistic bounds. They are now becoming one fellowship through the power of God's love and through the indwelling of God's Spirit. But now this education takes place where Peter stands up in front of them and first of all says, yeah, it is 9 o'clock in the morning. And yeah, we are acting like we're drunk, but we're not drunk. We are filled with God's Spirit and something new is happening in our fellowship. He then sets the stage for both making a parallel with the prophet Joel,
And in the second chapter of Acts, parallels the second chapter of Joel, where Peter says, now both our men and our women are going to prophesy. That is, they're going to speak the truth. They're going to testify to what God is doing in our fellowship. They're going to stand for what is right. We are going to move out into this world, and we are going to represent Jesus Christ to the people around us, men and women. And there's also a reference to the 11th chapter of Numbers. Fascinatingly, in our lectionary, which is our traditional churches all over the world use what's called the lectionary to have a series of Old Testament, New Testament, and epistle writings, or Psalms, epistles, and Gospels from the New Testament, paired with Old Testament passages that we're called every week to utilize. And interestingly, the lectionary passage that is paralleled with Acts chapter 2 from the New Testament is this Old Testament passage in Numbers 11. And it's where Moses is exhausted and he's distracted and he's tired of putting up with these people that have just been making him crazy in many ways. Just completely every day he feels like he's having to deal with their pettiness and their foolishness and set them right. And he's just weary. And somebody comes to him and says, Master, Moses, there are two men in our fellowship, two fellow Hebrews, and they are prophesying. And should we stop them? Should I go tell them to stop? You need to make sure and stop this because only you are supposed to be prophesying. And Moses says, if only all of us in Israel would prophesy. What a gift it is, Moses is thinking to himself, to have at least a few people who also begin to be inspired by God's Spirit to do something significant, to say something profound, and to live in ways that can exemplify what God needs for us to do and to be. What Peter is teaching, the education that he's giving here, is the connection with Joel in the testifying, the prophesying, the speaking truth to power, the trying to make what is wrong right. And this widespread openness now. It's not just the leaders who were disciples who can be prophesying and speaking truth to power and trying to hold people accountable for what is good and right and important. But it is now all of us believers. The men and the women shall prophesy, says Joel, says Peter, and Moses. If only all of us would get on board with hearing what God's Spirit is saying to us today to do and to be and to represent. It's a powerful moment of education, and it is one that is so important to see the context of these folks. It's not just that they were being inspired and liberated, but they were also being educated. This continues on following this Acts chapter 2 experience, where we find ourselves listening to people like Paul. So Peter is educating the folks in chapter 2, but Paul carries this mantle as well throughout the rest of the New Testament, both in his letters and in the experiences he's having with these early churches and in communication. One of the ones that I find fascinating is from Ephesians chapter 4, verse 28. And what occurs in this passage is one of those things that's easy to just sort of slip by and not think about too seriously. But the 28th verse says, thieves must give up stealing rather let them labor and work honestly with their own hands. Now, what's interesting to me, fascinating about this, is from this Pentecost experience, all these folks are gathered, the fellowship is opened up, inspiration is taking place, liberation is taking place, education is taking place. Now there's a church established in Ephesus, and in the church, apparently, according to the way this is worded, there's apparently a group of folks who have made a living stealing things. They're thieves. Now, was it a section in the church that was labeled thieves sit here? Who knows? It's not an imperative. It's not as though the letter is saying
You thieves, stop stealing. It just says thieves should stop stealing. But implicit, I think, in the way the letter is worded, there's a group of folks in the church who have made their livelihood taking things from other people, and they're being called out. Now, the good thing about this, the message I think this sends is from the Pentecost experience in chapter 2, the floodgates are opened that all people are welcomed and called forth. I love this. This story reminds me of Adam Hamilton, a United Methodist pastor in Kansas City, Missouri. His Church of the Resurrection is this huge congregation where they have anywhere from 5,000 to 10,000 people every Sunday morning. And they have a parking problem, as you can imagine. And so they have parking attendants out in the parking lot. And one of the parking attendants came into Adam Hamilton's office and said, "Pastor, we just had an experience out in the parking lot. I was trying to park tell this guy where to park, and he gave me an obscene sign. He shot me an obscene sign. What are we going to do about that?" And Adam Hamilton, interestingly, said, "That is great. I am so glad." Well, this church member, this parking lot attendant said, "What do you mean, Pastor? I mean, he shot me an obscene sign. What are we going to do about that?" And Adam Hamilton said, "I'm so glad, because that's exactly the kind of people we need in our church. Those are exactly the kind of people that need to be exposed to the gospel of Jesus Christ." This is one of those moments where in this church in Ephesus, apparently there is a group of people who need to be exposed. They need to be educated about what does it mean when we follow Jesus. It means that we don't take stuff from other people. It means that we live our lives as examples of disciples of Jesus Christ. It is a matter of educating ourselves, moving ourselves forward. Paul is also a good example of the real value, the import of education. Now, we assume that there is this Damascus Road experience where Paul, in a lightning bolt, just an overnight transcendent experience, himself has a moment of inspiration and liberation, and then turns around the next day and starts teaching Sunday school and preaching on Sunday mornings and telling people about Jesus. In fact, that's sort of what Luke implies in the 9th and 10th chapter of Acts. But to read Paul's own words in Galatians chapter 1, which I encourage you to do, what Paul actually says about his own experience is, yes, indeed, he was inspired. His life was completely transformed. But what he did after that Damascus Road experience was not start preaching and teaching. He went away to what he calls Arabia, that is the wilderness. He went off and probably set himself aside with other Christian believers who he sat under and was educated by. He spent about 3 years in Arabia, he says. There was a time in that wilderness where he was being taught about what it was that both had happened to him and what God was doing in his spirit and what he was going to need to do with the fellowship of believers once he returned. And so this transformational experience for all of us, it doesn't happen instantaneously. It means that you and I, in our inspiration and in our liberation, need to take seriously the power and the import of our education, of learning more about church history, about the Bible, about the events surrounding us, about how all that integrates into what God is calling us to do and to be in these moments. The inspiration is not just to comfort us, but to make us strong and prepare us to send us out and to be a part of the world that is around us, out of our isolation that is now, in the coming days, to be witnesses and testifiers of God's good graces and good work and what is right and what is important. This brings us now to our fourth word. So we have inspiration, liberation, education, and finally, dedication. We learn through our education what it means, hopefully, to be a follower of Jesus. We also learn how the events around us need to be addressed and the concerns that we have. A friend of mine shared a story this past week that inspired me And it's this word dedication that emerges out of this. When we have been inspired, when we have been liberated, when we are in the process of being educated, we are then now a part of dedication. We are dedicated to God's purpose in our lives. And I love the word dedication also. You take it apart and it simply means to devote oneself to a spiritual enterprise, to give oneself to something beyond our own life. It is a highly spiritual discipline, dedication. I'm going to dedicate myself to the service of God because God has changed me. God has inspired me, liberated me. God is educating me. Now I dedicate myself to God's service. Well, this friend talked about her inspiration that she needed to do something in this difficult time. She had some extra time on her hands. She was not having to go into her office. She was looking for ways to help, and she realized that there were people in her church who needed food, but they couldn't go to the food pantries in the areas where food was being delivered because the lines, first of all, were hours of waits, so long, so many people sitting in their cars separated from one another. But many of these people in her church, she said, didn't have transportation. They weren't able to get there, or they couldn't get out of their homes, or they were infirmed, or they were unable, they were not mobile enough to get the food that they needed. So she's been taking it upon herself several times a week to simply go out in her car, wait in line. She's reading a book while she waits. She's making use of her time. She is educating and inspiring herself to be a better follower of Jesus. But she waits in line and moves through the line, sitting in her car, gets there, workers in masks deliver the food to her, and then she delivers that food both to folks in her church who are in need, and she brings food here to our assistance ministry so that sandwiches can be made and food offered to folks in need. This idea, this imperative of dedication on the heels of our education and liberation and inspiration is a vital part of this Pentecost moment where these regular folks are suddenly now empowered to move beyond their own fellowship and to go back to the places that they came from and all the language groups that they represented and represent now the power of Jesus in their lives. One final element of this dedication, another word that dedication sort of means is it can mean to proclaim. It has within it the idea of to speak out of, to proclaim, and to live out. It is to speak in both word and deed, to live out, to dedicate oneself to God's service. This is a difficult time in all of our lives because we're separated from one another. We are missing each other. We can't be together in this fellowship where we can feel this corporate sense of inspiration together. But we also know in the life of our country, there are things happening that are very concerning. And as Christians, it is incumbent upon us to dedicate ourselves to help remind people what is right and good and important, and provide the Christian perspective that is birthed on this day of Pentecost in the second chapter of Acts. There are three names I'd like to simply say to you that offer us a moment right now that we need to take seriously as Christian people, wanting to stand for what's right and say what's right and humbly try to figure out what is God calling us to do in these moments. And these names are simply Ahmaud Arbery, George Floyd, Christian Collins. Just in the last 2 weeks, we have become aware of horrible things happening in the lives of our country. One of them in Georgia, in Brunswick, where an unarmed black man was brutally shot. And in Minneapolis, Minnesota, an unarmed black man killed tragically. And then Christian Collins in Central Park, some of you maybe have seen this video, and I commend this video to you. Just simply Google black man in Central Park. And up will come this video of Christian Collins, who was in Central Park bird watching, and a woman begins to accuse him of just intimidating her, when in fact he's not intimidating her at all. And the tragedy in all three of these examples is that there are African American men, black men, who are victimized in ways that is something we need to take seriously. Now, most of you can figure out that I am a white man, have been for most of my life. Some of you may be saying, well, why is he talking about this? Because the Pentecost moment in the second chapter of Acts calls on us to take seriously events in our lives, in our surroundings, and as humbly as we can, as seriously as we can, with the inspiration that God has given us, with the liberation that God allows for us, the education that God provides for us, and the dedication that we are called to. You and I humbly and forthrightly and honestly and transparently, all of us need to confess, all of us need to be a part of trying to do what is right and good, and call all of us to be better at being citizens of this country and followers of Jesus. In the case of each of these men that I mentioned, there's a lot of anger, there's a lot of hurt. We as Christians don't necessarily need to jump on the bandwagon of the anger and the hurt. But what we can do, especially those of us like me who happen to be white, to take seriously that the second chapter of Acts, there are barriers that break down. It doesn't matter what language these folks are speaking. It doesn't matter where they're from. It doesn't matter what they look like. What matters is they all in that moment experience the Spirit of God, making them brothers and sisters. And we have people in our church who could have been Chris Collins or Ahmaud Arbery or George Floyd. We have members in our church that could have been innocent victims to suspicion, or let's just call it what it is, racism, and the sin that we need to lift out and call out that I think motivates tragically many of these events. Somehow this strange thing that is becoming known as white supremacy, that we as Christians need to take a firmer and stronger stance and say, not only is this wrong, it's a sin. And we need to call it for what it is. And we need to be reminded of the second chapter of Acts. And together stand and recognize that the inspiration that God has given to us, the liberation that God allows for us, the education that God continually gives to us, is providing for us now the opportunity for a dedication to say in our lives, not only will we not participate in this kind of behavior, but we will call it out. We will seek to be better. We will seek to stand as a light in our community and say, we as Christians cannot tolerate this kind of behavior. And we as Christians that emerge out of this birthday of the church in the second chapter of Acts, join with Christians across this world and say, God calls us to be the very best we can be in humility and in love with all people. Brothers and sisters, may this second chapter of Acts continue to empower you this week. May you feel not stuck anymore, but may you feel the power of God's inspiration in your life. May you feel a sense of liberation that you are enough with who you are, and the education that God moves you into and through, that the perspective of Pentecost breaks down barriers, opens up opportunities, makes us brothers and sisters, and gives us the strength of dedication to stand for what is right, to do what is right, and to be the kind of disciples of Jesus God calls us to be. Thanks be to God.